All right. Helping Parents Heal is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting bereaved parents to become shining light parents by providing support and resources to aid in the healing process. We go a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences and evidence for the afterlife in a non-dogmatic way. Affiliate groups welcome everyone regardless of religious or non-religious background and allow for open dialogue. Attendance today at the Helping Parents Heal meeting is voluntary, and we are here for the benefit of learning from and sharing with other parents whose children have passed away. It is understood that our discussions are intended to be confidential and not designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers to allow parents to be informed about many possible ways to heal, to connect with their children, and to learn about the afterlife. The views expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect those of Helping Parents Heal, and we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally. I'm going to turn it over to Irene Vuvalidis to introduce our guest speaker tonight.
Hi, everybody. Welcome this evening. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to introduce David Kessler this evening. For those of you that don't know David, he is one of the world's foremost authorities on grief and loss. David's personal experience as a child witnessing a mass shooting while his mother was dying in a hospital shaped his career and passion for healing. He is the author of 5 best-selling books, including You Can Heal Your Heart with Louise Hay. He co-authored 2 bestsellers with the legendary Elisabeth Kübler-Ross on grief and grieving and life lessons. His first book, The Needs of the Dying, a #1 best-selling hospice book, received praise by Mother Teresa. His newest book from Simon and Schuster is called Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief. David is the founder of grief.com, an invaluable resource to millions who are grieving. We were all looking forward to David's keynote presentation at the upcoming conference, which will be rescheduled, titled Finding Meaning, the Afterlife and Continued Connections. I want to personally thank David for the impact he has had on my own personal journey with grief and look forward to hearing him tonight. And we welcome him to our Helping Parents Heal family. Welcome, David.
Thank you. I'm just so honored to be here. And like you, I'm saddened that we're not all gathered in person. So I thought tonight I would talk to you a bit about really the grievers' response to what's going on and mix that in a little bit about what I was going to talk about. So let me start with just a little bit of what Irene alluded to, my story in this. I had a mother who was ill when I was a child. I grew up in hospitals. I know them really well. And when I was 13, she had kidney failure and had to go into a hospital in the big city. And we went there with her. And the hotel across the street, while she was dying, a fire broke out, which quickly they realized they had a mass shooting happening. So it was one of the first mass shootings in the US. It's interesting, just on a little side note about how things come full circle. At the same time I was dealing with my mother's death and that mass shooting, Vice President Biden was dealing with the death of his wife and child. And he had been elected to the Senate. And his first job in his first week of being a senator was dealing with that mass shooting in New Orleans. And it was interesting when he was vice president and his son died, he called and we talked. And as we got into the discussion about our worlds, and he said, how did you get into this? And I told him about that. And it was fascinating how he shared with me how, while he was dealing with his own personal grief, one of the first things he had to deal with is a mass shooting and how our lives had come back around in a whole nother way. So I dealt with that as a child. I often pass along to parents now that I wish there had been more resources, and in a way, I grew up to be the person that I think might have been able to help me. One of the things I often talk about is how when my mother was in the ICU, they wouldn't let me in because you had to be 14, and I would stand at these ICU doors desperately wanting to see her. And a few nurses would sneak me in or just not care, but there were a few that were like, rules are rules. And so that standing outside that door was a devastating experience for me. And I came out of that thinking, we've got to do this better. I just knew that not being allowed to be with her, the mass shooting happening, the way that happened, it was all just recipes for disaster. And, you know, none of us are going to make death good, but we shouldn't make death bad. And so many things went wrong in all those areas. So that was really my beginning in this work, and became hospice, grief specialist. It was important to Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who was my teacher, that I know the death piece and the grief piece. We live in a modern world where death and grief are very separate. So she wanted to make sure I knew both. That's why I sort of have books on death and books on grief. And I will say, I did have, you know, sometimes we have these unrecognized beliefs. I do think I had an unrecognized belief that my grief was in my childhood. That maybe when I was about 80, I was going to be dealing with a lot of grief. I mean, I had dealt with it through the years of working in hospice and end of life. I dealt with it personally in my childhood. I dealt with it in the AIDS epidemic. I dealt with it at the hospital. So I really did have this assumption that, like, my grief is behind me. Someday I'll be grieving again when we all get really old. I have two sons. I was not prepared, not that anyone is, for a call that came in telling me that he had died suddenly, unexpectedly. David is my son, my younger son. And one of the things that I talk about, this always gets me because I'm talking to you. I think back on all the parents that I counseled over the years. I mean, I can't tell you how many parents I've counseled. After my son died, the grief expert wanted to write them all a note and say, I had no idea how bad your pain was. And I think there was something devastatingly powerful for me to be thrown back into the epicenter of grief and to feel it again, but in a way I had never experienced it. So I came out of that feeling like I did want to continue with my career, but I wanted to go deeper. And so I had, let me just also tell you the other part of my career is doing 2 books with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, just so you know some of the history around this, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross had obviously written on death and dying in 1969. And we wrote a book together called Life Lessons. And she was my teacher, and we would always have these discussions. I would say, Elisabeth, you know, people are adapting your stages for grief. And she would go, they're for dying. And I go, I know, and people are adapting them for grief. And very poorly, I might add, Elisabeth. And she would go, well, I don't know. And then I don't know what happened, but I think somehow maybe it was her getting on the internet more. She saw how they were becoming 5 easy steps for grieving and just hated all that. So she said, okay, I want to write a book and clear some of the confusion up around the stages. And we wrote the book on grief and grieving. In the book, we formally adapt her stages for grief. And if any of you have read it on page 1, it was page 1 back then. It's now page 7 because Maria Shriver did an introduction now. But on page 1, it said, these are not a map for grief. They're not linear. There's no should in these. We have a million emotions besides these. Don't try to reduce grief to these stages. So I still live in a world where those stages came up. And I know you live in a world where you hear about those stages. And it's the other thing that was really challenging for me is that acceptance had this finality to it, that none of us ever thought there was a finality to grief. You know, I think about when people say to me, how long will I grieve? How long will my friend grieve? My response is always, well, how long is the person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time. And, you know, my hope is that we find ways to grieve with more love than pain in our own way, in our own time, at our own pace. So after David died, I had always been fascinated by Viktor Frankl's work because he, as you may know, was in the concentration camps. And he wrote about how he found meaning in the darkness. And I was always really amazed at this idea about how in your darkness can there be meaning? How in the darkest night can there be any kind of light? So I had thought about that concept, and I actually written a couple of chapters on meaning and grief. And I had put them away because I was out lecturing or something, and they got pushed to the side. And after David died, I was home, lectures had been canceled. I was poking around my office, and I ran across these chapters of meaning. And I had also thought, Elisabeth and I had talked about, well, what would come when you really begin to accept someone that's not, is it just acceptance? Is there meaning? Is there hope? Is there purpose? So I ran across these chapters, and I looked at these chapters, and I just was one of those moments, you know, that feeling of you're so deep in pain. And I looked at these chapters and I went, yeah, like that's going to help. And I threw them down. And then about a week later, I picked them back up and I started reading them. And it really didn't take away the pain, but it gave it a little cushion. And I started listening to other parents as they would talk to me. And I would just sort of hear and notice they began to talk about meaning. And we talk about meaning using many different words. We talk about it as post-traumatic growth. We talk about it as collateral beauty. I mean, but there's a lot of different words people use about that light that we see in the darkness. So I was fascinated by that. And I had been in New York, and I had put on Facebook that I was in New York. And my publisher was so lovely that they said they wanted to meet with me, Simon and Schuster. Could we all get together? And we had this just beautiful get together that you don't think a publisher would actually have. And we talked, and you know, when they asked me how I was doing and what I'm doing to comfort myself, and I started talking about it, they said, didn't you once say that might be the 6th stage? And I went, well, yeah, but, and they're like, you should really think about that as a book. So I pondered it and decided that it could be a book. And I was really honored that the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation and the her family gave me permission to subtitle it The 6th Stage of Grief. And one of the reasons we did want to link it to the stages is because we all wanted a chance to go back in a book that might have a chance of getting read. And once again, tell everyone, the stages are not a map. Stop that, everyone. So it was a chance to go back and do that. it's interesting, 2 months ago, I was at Stanford University, and Ken Ross, Elizabeth's son, donated all of her work to Stanford University, and it's going to be housed there so people will be able to see it directly. And one of the things I thought was so interesting at that ceremony is they played some clips from Elizabeth's work that I'd never seen before. And one thing that happens to me on Facebook and Instagram a lot is sometimes I'll post something and someone will go, I know who you are. You've written with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. You and her are just trying to neaten up our grief and make it tidy and make us follow your rules. And I always find that such a ridiculous notion that we can make grief neat and tidy. Like, there is nothing neat or tidy about grief. It is by definition messy and organically messy, as it should be. And the idea of calling Elisabeth, we want to follow the rules, I think is so funny, because Elisabeth was such a rule breaker. I mean, just the hugest rule breaker in the world, and loved breaking rules, like literally enjoyed breaking rules. So they showed this clip of Elisabeth, and they showed this clip from like the late 1960s. Now, some of you are old enough to remember, at that point, there were 3 networks. Like, that was your choice. There were 3 networks. There was something called UHF that we didn't really understand yet. But we had 3 networks. And so Elisabeth is on this talk show. And the host comes on and he says, hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. We've got a very important show tonight. We are going to be talking about death, loss, and grief. And we have as our special guest Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who's written the blockbuster book and was on Life magazine and all that. And he said, I know you all want to change your dial, but do not. You must watch this show. Do not change your dial. And then he says, Elisabeth, I want you to look right at the camera and tell America why they should not change the dial, why they must watch this show. And Elisabeth goes, where? And he goes, right there. And she goes, hi, everyone. If you want to change the channel, it's okay. Bye-bye. I'll see you another time. Bye-bye. And the host was like, no. And she goes, if they're not ready, no, it's not time. They'll think about this when they're ready. And that's really who Elisabeth was. So it's just amazing to me how grief, and Elisabeth, you've often heard the saying that she sort of revoked her work or denounced it. And what that came from is, can you imagine writing 26 books on children in grief, on the afterlife, on AIDS, all these books, each of them, what, 50,000 words? So that's hundreds, millions of words she wrote, thousands of lectures, and all anyone wants to reduce you to is 5 words. That's what personally used to get to her. That's like, one of the things I remember is even clinicians would come over and say, oh, Elisabeth, I have this case, and they'd spend 20 minutes telling us the case. And then they'd go, all right, here's the question. And we'd be like, okay, what's the question? And they'd go, what stage are they in? And Elisabeth would go, will you forget the stages and just meet people where they are? So that was sort of the world that I grew up with people always trying to reduce things to the stages. But I have to tell you, people would say to me, what's it like to be the grief expert whose child died? And I said, I'm the father who had to bury his son. But I did have that grief expert's mind here that was sort of listening and go, is everything you've been teaching true? Is this going to play out for you? And I did have lots of times when I would be angry and go, oh, all right, well, clearly that stage there. And then I'd be like, I can't believe it. Well, that stage there. And I'd go, maybe if I had just done this, he'd still be alive. I went, oh, there's bargaining. And I had so many moments like that. But as time went on, And I felt myself getting glimpses of acceptance. I knew acceptance was not going to be enough. I knew I had to find meaning around my son's death. And so that was really one of the other things that I wanted to do, a book that would honor him. And the other thing about all this is that people get confused who haven't read the book. I'll tell them, there's no meaning in the death. If your child died of cancer, there's no meaning in the cancer. There's no meaning in a murder. The meaning is what we do afterwards. And meaning doesn't sugarcoat it. It doesn't take away the pain. It's in addition to the pain. It's a comfort in the pain. It's a little bit of a life raft in the pain. And I think one of the surprises about the book is people who come up to me going, I can't find meaning. I can't find meaning. And I'll go, when did your loved one die? Last month. I'm like, you got a lot of other stuff to go through. You got plenty to go through. There's going to be time for meaning. So that's sort of who I am and how I came to be the lucky person to be with all of you. And let me also talk for just a few moments about what we're going through in the world. I think it's really interesting to see the world's responses to coronavirus and to see people in grief's responses. Here's what I've noticed. For some people in grief, it's a reminder of our resilience. You know, you'll hear people go, my child died, I got this. Like, I can get through this. If I live through my child dying, I can handle this. For other people in grief, the virus, the pandemic, triggers old losses. It just activates them. It also, for some, brings up a lot of fear of no more deaths. I don't want anyone else to die. I've been through too much. Other people will talk to me about how they have no fear of death. They're like, look, if I die, I'm going to be with my child. That's the worst scenario, and that's not a bad one. It's also interesting to hear people talk about some people are wishing they had their child with them during this fearful time. Other people are like, I'm so glad my loved one's not here. So we all have different response to that. And I think one of the surprising things for me is I literally did I was on a 30-city book tour. I got to about 20 cities. You were one of my cities coming up. And it's an uphill battle to write a book about grief. It's an uphill battle. Any of you that have written a book on grief know that you're writing about something no one wants to talk about. And it's an uphill battle to get any press on a book about grief. In these last 2 days, I have done Fox TV, PBS, CNN, The Today Show, Australian TV, BBC. Everyone wants to talk about grief. And I think something that I've heard a number of people articulate is like, really? Now the world wants to talk about grief? Like, did you notice we were in grief and like no one was talking about our grief? But now everyone wants to talk about the grief. And it's the grief of the fear of what might happen. We haven't even come to what might happen. We're still in the fear of what might happen. So it's such a strange, unique time. And did I do something wrong? I think I almost lost you for a moment. It's such a strange, unique time. And besides it being a pandemic, I spent a decade in the hospital world. I trained for biohazardous events. I trained to put the suits on, to put the tents up. I've been at the morgue at 9/11 and Ground Zero. I mean, I've trained with the police for all this. I get the pandemic part of it. We've had pandemics before. We've had AIDS crises. I remember studying the Spanish flu. We have never in this world had an event where the dead cannot be buried by their family. I mean, now people are dying. I have a friend in New York. Her mom lives in the building next to her. Single mom, 2 kids. And her mom got sick. They had decided they weren't going to see the 80-year-old mom. The 80-year-old mom wasn't going to see the kids because no one wanted to get anyone sick. She had to go to a New York hospital yesterday because she got sick. And my friend is like, I can't go. We've never been in this situation where people in grief are going to have people die and not be able to see them, not be able to have a funeral, not be able to gather. This is all so unprecedented. One of the things is that, and some of you are in the group I know who are watching this, is one of the things is I started getting emails from people whose grief groups had been canceled and they couldn't get into their grief group because there was no in-person group anymore. And one woman actually got me on the phone and told me her husband of 40 years ago died, I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and was in an apartment alone and couldn't get any support. So one of the things I just had to do is I'm doing a daily online grief support group for people. So just know as a resource, if you're needing any more support during the day or another place to connect, I know you've got wonderful groups here. Just know it's one more place that I put out in the world where we can all connect and find community, because grief is so isolating. I mean, I'm so talking to the choir here. Grief is so isolating on good days, much less when there's a pandemic and you can't leave the house. So this is such a strange world we're living in now. And we're having to deal with so much anxiety, and it's just very new to all of us. So I think that was sort of my introduction. I'd love to chat with you and have questions, and we can talk about anxiety or anything else you want. So
Thanks,
thank
David.
you. Hi,
Yeah,
Irene.
thank you. If anybody has any questions for David or any comments, or want to just talk about what you're going through right now, what are you experiencing going through this time in terms of, us having lost our children and going through, you mentioned, David, a couple different responses people could have, but does anybody want to talk about what you're going through?
Yeah, I'm curious. Raise your hand if you had that feeling of like, really, the whole world wants to talk about grief now? Like, really, no one wanted to talk about my grief, and now, like, we're all going to talk about grief, really? You know?
We have a question from Camberly. She says, where can we log on for your grief groups, David?
Sure. So the easiest thing is you can go to grief.com and you can see the address for the group, but I'll actually write it in here so you can see it easily. See if I can do it. It's facebook.com/groups/David Kessler. And every day we take on a different topic and then we do Q&A. It's like a half hour. People felt that was sort of the best time, but it's a lot of peer support.
Okay. Thank you. Stacy says, I'm scared for my living child, not scared for myself, even as a frontline healthcare provider. So I know that's
Where's
something
Stacy. Oh, Stacy's right there. Hi, Stacy.
Yeah, for us to have living, other children, I know that I'm scared for my daughter. She's 23. So
Let's talk about anxiety. Here's what anxiety is. Anxiety is really anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the healthy grief we have when we're growing up. We know someday our parents are going to die, and our mind is sort of adjusting to that concept throughout the years. That's healthy anticipatory grief. Now, with this pandemic, our primal mind is geared there's a lion, there's a tiger, let me run. We are geared to see the problem. It's unnerving to have this virus that you might have, that might be in the air, that might be on the doorknob, that could be on the mailbox. That's unnerving that we kind of can't see the enemy, right? So what our mind does is it grabs the worst scenario and begins playing it like a movie. Suddenly we see, oh my gosh, I don't think I could lose another child. We see our child's death who's living right now. I don't think I could lose my parents, my grandparents. And our mind begins to play the worst scenarios. That's somewhat normal. It's called catastrophizing. All of us in this group have had a catastrophe, so it wouldn't be surprising if we're catastrophizers. But it's important to not believe all those images of the future. And when we look at those images of the future of people we know loving and dying and all that, I say that's the worst scenario. At least counterbalance it with the best scenario. My living child might not get it. My living child maybe will get it, but have just a mild fever and be fine in a week, no big deal. So at least force your mind to do the best and the worst and not just those negative images. And the truth is, some of us worried about our children dying before. Some of us never imagined it would happen. And it kind of happened to both groups. So, you know, thinking about it isn't going to make it happen or not happen. So why put yourself through those images? I always say, don't ever attend a funeral early.
Yeah, that's good advice. Thank you. Dolores says I know many people feel a lot of guilt about their child's death. Can you address that?
I'll tell you a background book story. You'll appreciate this. I wrote in the book in so many different chapters in Finding Meaning about self-blame and guilt and the what if and the regrets. And the editor says to me, David, I looked at the first draft and you keep going back to this concept and you keep naming it different things, but it's really about self-blame. And she said, I don't want the book to be repetitive, so I found a solution. And I said, you found a solution to self-blame, really? She goes, yeah, do you want to hear it? I went, sure, yeah, I've been waiting to hear this. She said, in the first chapter, just right, self-blame often accompanies grief, but is not warranted. And I went, really? You think that'll fix it? Like everyone in grief will go, oh, thanks for saying that, David. I'm going to stop blaming myself. And she goes, well, I don't know about that. And I said, I actually do know about that. 95% of my work is self-blame and the what if and the regrets. And you know, any parent can tell you, I mean, I can remember when I became a parent, one of the first things someone said to me is, you're only as happy as your most unhappy child. And our lives are governed by our kids. You know, how happy you are. I mean, no matter what happens to your kid, it feels like it's part of you. We want our kids to be happy and healthy. And on a good day, if something goes wrong, we go, oh, did we do too much of this or not enough of that? So if they die, well, of course, on some unconscious level, you're going to go, well, clearly I wasn't successful. I mean, whenever a parent, a friend of mine, asks me for advice, like parenting advice, I'm like, really? You're asking me for parenting advice? And they're like, yeah. And, you know, with my close friends, I'll go, you know, I had a child die. I mean, you want parenting advice? And they'll go, yeah. And it's such a reminder to me about how even I have those inner thoughts of, oh, my parenting advice isn't good because a child died. It's such a primal thing we do is blame ourselves. And so much of the stuff parents blame themselves is just not true. It just isn't actually the cause of their child's death. You know, there's something about our mind, and I really researched this a lot about how brain science works in our mind and why the good things, our mind's like Teflon, nothing sticks. The bad things are like Velcro. Things stick and they stick forever. The bad memories, the haunting thoughts stick. And so that's a lot of the work I do, is helping people to hear that. And it's one of the reasons I love doing groups and retreats, because people always wanted like do one-on-one counseling with me. And I'm always like, I'm not very good at it, actually, believe it or not. Because there's something in a group that, you know, if I said to Dolores, Dolores, you're not to blame, and let me explain why, and I kept talking to Dolores, she might not get it. But if she sees me talking to Irene, she can go, oh, Irene's saying the same things I am. I would never blame Irene for her child's death. Maybe I shouldn't be blaming myself. That's what I love about the peer group interaction, is that we see ourselves in each other, and it seems to help us heal in a way that one-on-one has never been my strength with people. So I hope that helps a little.
Yeah. I
And
think
that'll
that's
be
great.
one of the things, one of the topics coming up is dealing with the what ifs and the if onlys, I know in my group that we're going to be doing.
Yeah. Irene said she'd like for you to talk about a meaningful passage in your book.
Yes, so here's the book. I just love this book, David, thank you. And you could see all the little stickies in it because there are just some great passages. I actually have this by my bed, and when I need to hear something or reread something,
Well,
I
tell me a
know,
passage you like.
okay, this is the passage I'd really like you to talk about. When someone dies, the relationship doesn't die with them. You have to learn how to have a new relationship with them. You can still keep learning from them in your everyday life. I just love that. You know, it's helped me so much to continue to have a relationship with Carly. And when someone asked me if I have any children, which used to be such a paralyzing question for me after she passed, now I say, yes, I have a daughter. She resides in spirit. And it was just so freeing for me. And I think for parents to realize that we'll always be our
Right.
children's parents, even though they no longer walk this earth. So I just love that.
And I think, you know, we know how to love people when they're physically present. We don't know how to love them in their absence. And I was doing a radio show, and the talk show host said to me, and I think her brother had died by suicide. She goes, well, love doesn't continue after we die. And I was like, have you stopped loving your brother? I mean, really, do you not love him anymore? And she's like, oh, well, I don't know. And I said, you know, I don't believe we quit loving them. And I actually don't think they quit loving us. I think the love continues. I send my son love every day. I would love him to be physically present, but I honor him emotionally and spiritually present. One of the things that's interesting, I know I mentioned all this in the book, but in my hospice work, when I've been called in to see people who are dying, many times I'm with the family members, and the family members will be sitting there, and I'll walk in and the person will be asleep as they're dying. Might be, you know, a week out or a few days. And I'll say, do you ever come in like this? And they're sleeping, and they'll go, yeah. And I go, what do you do? And they'll go, I sit here and I watch them sleep. And I said, I'd like you to do something. Turn your chair with your back to the person. And they're like, why do you want me to turn my chair with my back to my loved one? I said, because in this life, we rely on the physical. Irene's there because I see her. Dolores is there because I see her. I want you to sit with your back to your loved one and feel them spiritually and emotionally. The physical is going to die, but I want you to begin developing your muscles to feel them. Because if you sit there with your back to them, you're still going to feel them, even though you can't physically see them. And so it's good to practice with those muscles and to know that. So I think that's very, very important, that how to continue having a relationship. And I'll tell you, I also talk in the book about, there was a time when the thought was, oh, let's have people write a goodbye letter to our children and say goodbye and end it. And that was therapeutically ruled out very quickly as not good. And now continued connections are thought of as very important in grief. So I'm glad we're more open about it and talking about it, and realizing, mainstream is realizing that's an important part of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I tell you my shirt story? Do you know the
Sure.
shirt story, anyone?
Sure.
My son had a favorite shirt, and it was a casual shirt. And there were plenty of times we would be maybe going to dinner somewhere or doing something, and of course he'd always walk out with that shirt, and I'd go, you got to put on a dressier shirt. And he'd be like, really? And I'm like, yeah, we're doing this or that, you need a dressier shirt. Favorite shirt. Still has it, wears it all the time. And then he has this wonderful girlfriend who's social worker. And when he dies in the shirt. So when, after he died, going through his stuff at his apartment, his girlfriend is there with me. And I'm saying to her, is there anything you want? Not really thinking it through, like, is there anything you want? And she goes, I'd like the shirt. And on the outside, I'm like, oh, I gotta give her the shirt because I just said anything. On the inside, I'm like, why didn't I say anything but the shirt? Darn it. But she said, I want the shirt. So I said, okay, I gave her the shirt. A year later, we had a ceremony at his graveside. She shows up with the shirt. She lays it on his grave and says, I'm not supposed to have the shirt. And I am, and she goes, anyone who wants a shirt. And she didn't get to finish the sentence before I rushed and grabbed the shirt and went, I'll take it. And I got the shirt. I quickly, it still had his smell on it. I quickly put it in a Ziploc bag and another Ziploc bag and another Ziploc bag. And I put it in a drawer. And I thought, gosh, I wanted that shirt to see it. And now I've put it away that I'll never see it. And the next thing, at my lectures, people started popping up wearing the shirt. And when they would pop up and wear the shirt, early on, I told them, you're wearing, my son's favorite shirt. And I realized it made them uncomfortable. So I decided not to do that anymore. But I was just amazed because I would play with myself and I'd go, this is only a group of 20. No one's going to have the shirt. And someone would walk in with the shirt. Or this is a group of 600. No one's going to wear the shirt. It's too hot. It's too cold a day. And someone wore the shirt. So it's been interesting for me to see that shirt everywhere, in the retreats everywhere. And what was fascinating is I was doing my first retreat the week the book was coming out. And I was so nervous about doing this retreat because there were so many layers to it. It is, you might have even been there, Dolores. It was a retreat about a new book that's also about my son dying. He's in this book, he's in this retreat. It like had multi-layers of pain and excitement and a new book. And then on top of it, I got a call that the Oprah Winfrey Network wanted to send someone to the retreat. And I immediately said, no, you can't come to the retreat just as a bystander. And they said, no, she actually wants to come because she's dealing with grief. And I said, well, she has to come as a, participant. There's no bystanders. And so they were like, okay, no, she wants to do it. So then I remember being back in the room going, oh my gosh, like as if this isn't enough. There's a book, it's my son dying, a retreat, and now Oprah Winfrey's got to send someone here. And I'm like, geesh. The woman walks in with his shirt on. And during the weekend, I tell the story. And she comes up to me and she goes, I'm wearing the shirt, aren't I? I'm like, why would you think you're wearing the shirt? There's 100 people here. Why would you think it's you? Because it's like, why would she? She goes, I am someone, I don't care about clothes. I throw clothes on and I walk out the door. She says, I changed my shirt 5 times and just felt like something was wrong until I put this shirt on. So that's one of my signs, because I'm a very open skeptic, but that's one of my signs that, you know, my son is around and that relationship continues. So, all right, let's get to some others.
Thanks. Claudia says that she mentioned to her husband that she's just relieved that she doesn't need to worry about her son David right now. David's in spirit. I know he's well and happy. I'd like to know what you think the purpose of this all is. What is the spiritual purpose for what we're going through now?
The pandemic or bereaved parents or all of it?
I think she's talking about the pandemic.
The pandemic. Well, here's how I normalize it. Every generation gets something. You know, my generation got the AIDS epidemic. Generation before that got Vietnam. Generation before that got World War II. Generation before that got World War I, the Depression. You know, every generation gets something. Somehow, I think so many people were sobered up. Young people, I mean, I went to the Staples Center after Kobe Bryant had died. You know, for young people, it was their JFK moment. Like someone young could die. They had never thought about it. They knew that grandma might die someday, but not someone in their 40s and not someone's child. And then this pandemic, you know, every generation gets sobering challenges that we have to grow through. Why are this generation, you know, some of us have like had a few of these things. But I think if there's something like that, that just normalizes it for me that, of course, horrible stuff's going to happen in the world to every generation. That's how life works. No one gets out of this world without challenges.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Camberly asks, do you have any advice for young adults, teens at home who may already suffer from depression and grief from losing a sibling, and now they're stuck in a state like Washington that is on lockdown and they're feeling isolated?
Yeah, I'm on lockdown too. You know, not a teenager though. But one of the things I think is so important is to validate their pain and their additional grief. You know, there's times when my older son's talking about the pandemic, I want to say to him, you know, my goodness, we've lived through David dying. Is this really that bad? But, you know, I have to realize, well, if he wants to feel disappointed in everything he can't do now, he gets to do that. And my job is to validate that. My job isn't to go, well, you live through worse, you can make it. My job is to go, it does suck. You can't do that. It is crappy. You can't do that. I mean, we can say to each other, maybe peer to peer, we've lived through our children dying, we can handle this. But we can't say that to young people. You know, it is a grief for them. They're not getting to go on their spring break, or they're not getting to do their project, or they're not getting to see their friends. So it is an additional grief for them that they're going through. And I think our job is to validate it.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I've got a question here that was sent privately. It says, I just want to know my son is happy. I want to learn how to connect to him. How do I learn how to listen or see clues for my son?
not really my area of expertise. It's funny, I do a lot of work with mediums and they joke with me about I'm such an open skeptic. I mean, for someone who does work with mediums, like I don't, not actually my field that much, but I work with Maureen Hancock and John Holland, and there's a lot of people I work with who probably know those things better than me. But I would say this, I would say, grief is an organic experience. Everyone who's lived has had ancestors and people who've died. I joke about you come from a long line of dead people. Grief is a very organic experience. So when I think about my short story, there was no part of me that was looking for a sign. And I know my son purposely, if I was looking for a sign, would be sort of dodging the ball. It's interesting. There's one medium that I encountered who said to me once, "Oh, I could get your son for you." And I thought to myself, if my son heard that, he would purposely come through everyone but you. That's just who my son was. But I think you just have to organically let them happen. And I'm a big believer in the more grief work you do, the more we deal with our pain up front, the more we can be open and recognize them. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
By the way, someone says it's very sweet. They said they're going to get the book. I just want you to know, if you go to sixstage.com, and you're going to buy the book, you can go there, and then you can buy it from anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever, if you want to walk into a bookstore or online. There's all kinds of links. But then when you get it, it's going to have a place, and you can put in your receipt number, or you can put in Helping Parents Heal, and it will give you a free course that I did. So you'll get a free companion course with the book. So
okay.
Get
Get the book and then go there and put in the
you
receipt
can
number?
get it right through there if you want.
Okay.
Or if you, like Irene, I don't know if you've got the course, but you can just put in Helping Parents Heal and you'll get the course for free.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Tracy says, is anyone afraid that after so many years, as our grief softens, that we are forgetting? Or maybe I should be doing much more, so I don't get comfortable with the loss?
There's a strange, I talk about the underlying beliefs coming up that don't serve us. Somehow we have an unconscious belief. If we release the pain, if we begin to lose some of the pain, we will lose our connection. We will forget them. My mother died almost 50 years ago. There is no part of me that has forgotten her. I don't have a lot of pain around her death. I have a lot of love and light for her. I smile when I think about my mother. I don't know that there's a lot of pain there anymore. But 50 years later, I think about Barbara Bush. Barbara Bush, my goodness, she, had two presidents in the White House, who were kids. She had a husband and a son in the White House. She had tons of kids, tons of grandkids. And her daughter, Robin, who died, never was far from her heart. And she even talked about Robin on her deathbed. There is no chance any of us are forgetting. That's just a weird unconscious feeling we have. It's our ego trying to hold on to the pain. But, when we release some of the pain in our own time, in our own way, we'll find we're connected only in love. We'll be connected only in love, but the connection isn't going away. But I'm glad you brought that up because it's so true. We all think that. Colleen says she did the course. It was amazing. Oh, well, that's sweet.
Yeah, a couple of people said they really liked the course.
Good.
Someone says, do we get to know what the shirt looks like?
No.
Susan asks, we are on an infinite journey, David. Do you believe there might be a seventh stage, something even beyond meaning?
Well, one of the things I think that's for us is obviously people ask me all the time, is there life after death for our children who have died? And I say, of course, I believe there is. But another question is there life after death for us? Do we get to live? And I think it's something every parent has to grapple with. Do we get to live? I want to live a life that honors my son. I want to live a life that makes meaning. I mean, I can't imagine not having a little pain. I mean, I just always think there's going to be some pain there. But I just really want a life that honors him. I mean, my life continues on. There was moments I thought maybe it wouldn't, but it does. So given that it continues on, I want a life that honors him.
Thanks, David. I think